John Bertoni, MD, PhD, was trained at University of Michigan and has worked in Ann Arbor, San Antonio, Philadelphia, and in Omaha since 1989, where he was chair of the neurology for 20 years. John is now working at UNMC and the VA as a professor of neurology sciences. John, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. This is like a dream come true. This is the first of many of what I hope to be master classes of our own. I hope someday we can have these in the flesh like normal, but we have to get from where we are today to where we want to be in the future. And we're lucky to have as our speaker, Marv Bittner. Now, he's a professor of internal medicine and medical microbiology and immunology at Creighton University and is an adjunct associate professor at UNMC. He's also deputy chief of staff at the VA. He received his MD at Harvard, and we ran into each other for the first time in the 70s at University of Michigan. I still remember Marv back then. And then he went on from there to infectious disease fellowship at University of Minnesota. He's certified in both fields, and he is the recipient of many teaching awards. He went on to get a master's degree in epidemiology at Harvard School of Public Health. He's the ideal person to talk about this. He's a straight talker. Make sure you put in your questions in the chat room. We will field them. Dr. Bittner has made several service trips to Latin America to help out the needy there. He's famous for volunteerism. He's the past president of our Omaha Medical Society, and he has repeatedly been listed among the best doctors in America. So with that, I want to give kudos to Timothy and counterparts for keeping our places clean and informing us and the signage about what to do if we have symptoms. Please, Marv, take it away.
Thanks, John. And I want you to remember a few things. Cover your cough, wash your hands, and stay home if you're sick. So the take-home messages I'll give you right at the top again. Cover your cough, wash your hands, and stay home if you're sick. Talking about COVID-19 is at the same time hard for me and easy for me. It's hard because I don't really know you. I don't know your level of knowledge of infectious diseases. And I don't know how you're approaching COVID-19 from an emotional standpoint. I hope you're not like my cousin in Florida who within the past year lost her brother to a stroke. Then her mother moved in with her, and it's been a rough relationship. A few months ago, she bought a business, and it's almost completely disappeared due to COVID-19. Or you may be like some more distant cousins of mine whose parents were in their late 80s, living in an assisted living facility in Connecticut, and within days of each other, they died of COVID-19. So it's hard for me to talk to you because I don't know how much you know about it and how you're feeling about it. In other respects, it's very easy for me to talk about it. For one thing, I have some experience in it, and you may wonder how that could possibly be if this is something that's just appeared on the scene within the past several months. Well, it turns out about a dozen years ago, I was part of a tabletop exercise in pandemic planning. It was a very elaborate exercise at UNO at the Kiewit Conference Center where they had the director of the county health department. The VA flew in somebody from Washington. It was a very elaborate multi-hour event with screens projecting purported news shows with various things we had to deal with. And it turns out that tabletop exercise involving a respiratory viral illness that started in China and spread to the US had a lot in common with what we're seeing now with COVID-19. So having that experience makes it a little bit easier for me to talk about COVID-19. In addition, just the fact that the world has been dealing with it for a few months makes it easier, because we're starting to get some very informative reports in the medical literature. And I know there are some people who say, well, you can pick and choose the medical literature and come up with whatever you want. I think that's really too harsh a criticism. When you consider the peer review that papers go through, my master's project was the sort of thing that generated over a half dozen pages of single-spaced comments when it was first submitted, and went back and forth. It was over a year before it made it into print. And because of my position, I'm actually one of the folks who does review articles before they appear in medical journals. I reviewed over 100 articles, and I can tell you, maybe you're critical about one paper, or there's a paper that just doesn't make sense. But when you get a consistent message in the medical literature, you've got to pay attention to it. And there are some consistent messages. I'd like to jump to an issue which I think is at the heart of the matter when you look at some of the controversies and when you ask questions about what can you do to protect yourself. And that has to do with the question, how does COVID-19, it's caused by a virus called SARS-CoV-2, how does that virus spread? And the answer is that if I had it and I would sneeze at you and some little droplets of my sneeze would get on your eyes, your nose, your mouth, I could spread it to you. Or if I coughed on you and got those droplets there, or I was just standing close to you and was speaking very enthusiastically and little bits of spit came out and hit your eyes, nose, or mouth, I could spread it to you that way. We call this droplet spread because it's spread by actual droplets that you can feel. Another characteristic of droplet spread, if you think about droplets that actually come out of somebody's mouth, if you simply stand several feet away from me, unless I develop talents as a world champion spitter, there's no way that my spit is going to reach more than a few feet away from me. And that's the basis for the advice to maintain that 3 to 6 foot distance from other people. Now, I've got to tell you that that has some other implications as well. In the hospital, in medical settings, the way we protect ourselves from droplet spread is by wearing ordinary surgical masks. Because if, let's say I have COVID-19 and you're taking care of me and you have a surgical mask on your nose and mouth and maybe a little shield popping up with some eye protection, I can snort and sneeze at you and those droplets are going to hit the eye shield or the surgical mask, and that will protect your eyes, nose, and mouth from getting infected. And there's some very distinctive patterns that we see with diseases that are spread by droplet transmission. An awful lot of the spread is within a household. And there's some studies recently that show that, one study will be not the same as the other, but maybe about 10% of the people who are sharing a household with somebody who's got it will pick it up. So there are a number of characteristics that say it's spread by droplets, and that gets back to the directions that I gave you right at the beginning of how you can prevent the spread. Cover your cough so those droplets don't get out. Wash your hands. So if you do touch something or other that is somehow contaminated, then if your hands are washed, if you happen to touch your face, touch your mouth, you won't be able to spread the virus. And stay home if you're sick. Certainly if you're not around other people, you're not going to be spreading it. So that's the basis of my main message. Now, the problem that's come up is this. Some people have been doing some laboratory experiments that have generated confusion. And they will do experiments where they go to the biocontainment unit at the University of Nebraska Medical Center where there were people who had COVID-19, check the air and find bits of virus. But does that really mean that they can contaminate the air? Well, I'll tell you, we have to be wary of some confusion in medicine. And it has to do with the fact that we humans breathe air. So when those droplets come from me, if I had COVID-19 and infect you, the droplets go through the air. But when doctors talk about airborne transmission, we're not talking about those droplets. We're talking about what might be called contamination of the air. There are very, very few diseases that spread that way, like measles and chickenpox. And the story is you might have someone who visited Disneyland, got measles, goes into a doctor's waiting room, coughs a little bit, leaves, and an entire hour passes. Somebody else comes into that room, takes a breath of air, and the measles patient has contaminated the air with little particles, and it can be transmitted. Droplet transmission like COVID-19 doesn't work that way, because you got to be there so when I sneeze on you, it hits your face right away. Otherwise, the droplets are just going to drop to the floor. So airborne transmission is very different. With droplet transmission, if you're in my household, you have a 10% chance of getting it. With diseases like measles and chickenpox, with airborne transmission, there's maybe an 80 or 90% chance you're going to get it. If I've got COVID-19 and I'm not taking any special precautions, I'll probably infect 2 or 3 other people on the average. With these airborne transmissions, it's easy to imagine with contaminating the air that somebody's going to infect 10 or 15 people. And with droplet spread, wearing that surgical mask can protect you. With airborne spread, you have to wear a special mask designed to block out the really tiny particles. The N95 mask is often used. Now, the problem we've had is that all sorts of folks in laboratories have done experiments where they say take a nebulizer, say a Collison nebulizer, and make really fine particles of COVID-19 virus like you'd never see in the real world, and show that it can contaminate the air like somebody with measles. But that doesn't prove airborne transmission. In fact, airborne transmission just doesn't make sense for COVID-19. And you have to distinguish between laboratory studies and real world events. And I tell people about an infectious disease study that was done in Sweden, and people were concerned about what they could do to keep the air in the operating room clean, because you don't want to go into an operating room, get cut open, and have some contaminated air, have some bacteria fall into your wound. So what they did was have people walk around wearing ordinary surgical scrubs. And as you might expect, if you think about the sleeves or the neck rubbing against the skin a little bit, little bits of skin rub off, and little bits of skin have the bacteria on it. And as a result, those bacteria can contaminate the air, and the air isn't quite as clean as you'd like. So that's what the people in Sweden found when you have folks who are wearing ordinary scrubs walking around an operating room. Then they did the next experiment, and they had people walk around the operating room naked. And they found, because they weren't wearing the scrubs, they weren't rubbing those little bits of skin off, and the air was a lot cleaner. So if we really want to cut down on surgical infections, maybe what we should do is have everybody in the operating room work naked. As those of you who've done any medical work know, people who work in the operating room wear clothes. There's a distinction between laboratory studies and real world. And there are all sorts of studies that have been done in the lab that can be a bit confusing. There was a sexually transmissible disease clinic in Portland that heard many people saying that they got their gonorrhea from a toilet seat. So what did they do? They put some bacteria that caused gonorrhea on a toilet seat, and they found they could still recover it a few hours later. Now, doctors like me still won't believe you if you said you got your gonorrhea from a toilet seat. There are laboratory conditions, and there's what happens in the real world. There are people who are trying to get you scared about transmission through the contaminated air route, like measles, but that's not the way things really work. And that's why the advice for preventing spread from droplets: cover your cough, wash your hands. If you're sick, stay home. still holds. So that's the basis of what you can do to prevent yourself from getting COVID-19. And now that we've had experience with it for months, we're seeing reports from China, we're seeing reports from Hong Kong, we're seeing reports from the US that confirm this. It does spread, but of the first 10 patients who came back to the US from other countries with COVID-19, in many cases they were not recognized as having COVID-19. The CDC studied over 400 of their contacts. The fraction who actually got COVID-19 from them was 0.45%. So that really is consistent with droplet spread and reinforces the message I gave you, which is cover your cough, wash your hands. If you're sick, stay home. And maybe I should add, if you're thinking about getting a job working in an operating room, you can expect to wear clothes. So I don't know if John or Timothy have some questions that have come up from the chat.
Thank you so much, Marv. That was amazing. And we have some specific questions coming. I just want to talk a little bit about how do we cope during these days. And there's a couple of things that we can just talk about. First of all, you're supposed to have anxiety and stress at something like this. It's a pandemic. So you've got to recognize that that's part of the process. So what we have to do is understand the enemy, and that's where Marv comes in and where the right stuff gets transmitted in the way of information. We must focus on what we can do and not what we can't do. We must focus on what we do know and wait for the science to tell us more. So it's good to also have a daily routine these days. Everybody seems to be at home, or many people. Us physicians have to go to work. It's also important to take good care of yourself. So our age is important, but it's our biological age. So get good sleep, exercise wisely, and eat well. Stay connected. We need physical distances, not social distancing. So we have to think positive and count our blessings. We're now able to communicate or get things done that we haven't been able to because we're at home. We're not polluting the planet as much. There's no end to the blessings. Focus on what you can do. Maybe relaxation techniques will be helpful, and also help others. Seek out the people that you worry about that may be alone and may need help. And remember, maybe you need help and you should talk it over with friends or counselors. It's also good to kind of limit the amount of time you spend on the news. So I want to say one more thing. The governor wants us, if you could get a paper and pencil and write this down, wants us to sign up on what's called Test Nebraska. That's one word, testnebraska.com. It's a simple thing to fill in, and that way we can beat Iowa. The governor wants to do better than the people in Iowa. So if you are chosen, you may get free testing or testing before others. We need testing, and we don't know really how many people have this with very few symptoms. So Timothy, take it from here. What questions do you have?
Great. Yes, thank you both. I appreciate that. We've got several questions that have come in. There are a few that came in around the subject of things getting kind of back to normal. And I'm going to kind of group several of these together. Dr. Bittner, the question of, is it safe and practical and reasonable that they are opening things like churches and restaurants and some businesses here we're hearing this, that this is coming this weekend or this coming week. Does that resonate to you as a reasonable thing? Would you personally be out attending or participating in those establishments? Are the workers going to be safe, and what precautions would you continue to take?
Okay, so the question is about resuming some of the usual activities, restaurants, churches, and so on. I would want to be 6 feet away from people. I would want to wear a mask. And the thinking is that we haven't eradicated SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, from the community. So there's still some concern, and there is, as John pointed out, the importance, I'm afraid, of maintaining physical distancing. Mm-hmm. So that does remain a concern. We'll have to see how it goes, and a number of states are taking different approaches, and we'll have to pay very close attention to what happens.
So I think as a corollary, we are told we can wear masks, and where can we get masks is a question. And then if we're going to be close to people, if we're going to be in a public place, that makes sense. I know in the hospital halls, we wear masks. And if we're with sick patients, we wear face shields and maybe gowns and gloves. But it's important for people to keep their distance. I don't go on crowded elevators anymore. I take the stairs.
Yeah, you might want to check cdc.gov, cdc.gov. They have information that's not just technical information for healthcare workers. They've got a lot of practical information, and you can read about the recommendations for masks. There are any number of designs for masks, many of which require no sewing ability whatsoever. You can find on the web.
Yes, absolutely. And if I could tag on to the mask question, we've had a couple people ask the question, do masks, and you described that wearing a mask might help other people or help you from transmitting to other people. What if you're a healthy person wearing a mask? And let's look at those ones like the fabric ones. We all know that the NIOSH N95s are supposed to be good, but is wearing any kind of mask helpful to a healthy person to keep them from getting sick in a space where they're with other people?
So the question is wearing any type of mask helpful to prevent somebody from getting sick? And I think you're right that there are different types of masks which are going to have different abilities to protect you. And at one end, you'd have something like N95, and there are even masks that provide even more protection than N95s, but those are ones that are commonly used in a healthcare setting. The catch with N95 is that they need to be properly fitted, and they need to be fitted so well that in some cases in the hospital, we're concerned that people may have medical conditions where we think it's unwise for them to wear a mask. They may not be able to tolerate it. The problem is that if you don't have really good fitting with a tight seal, and in fact, CDC recommends you do a seal check with inhalation and exhalation whenever you put on a properly fitted N95. Here's what it's like. If you have an N95 and it doesn't fit your face securely, it's like putting a screen on your window and, oh, I guess there's one little corner where you didn't quite tack the screen against the frame. Well, the bugs are just going to fly in. So for an N95 mask to be effective, it's not just a matter of grabbing one out of a bin at the store. Mm-hmm. The mask that it would be ideal for people to wear when they're out in public would be an ordinary surgical mask. The problem is we have a shortage. So for now, the idea is to try to reserve surgical masks for healthcare workers where we're more likely to encounter somebody who has COVID-19, and the performance of a surgical mask is particularly important. Cloth masks, other masks that people have designed have been studied now and then, and they provide some protection, not quite as much. But if you go back to the basics and say that you're talking about a virus that spreads by these droplets, to some extent, when you're wearing a mask, you're protecting other people, just in case you're one of the people who has it and doesn't quite realize it. Because 80% of the people who have COVID-19 have a mild illness or an illness that they don't notice at all. So one of the most important reasons to wear some sort of mask in public is just in the event that you do cough and don't cover your cough, that you have some protection against those little droplets flying out of your face. So the bottom line is the CDC website is where I'd go for guidance. They're recommending masks right now, cloth masks for the general public, and I would wear that in public. Face shields probably are helpful. They're not as highly touted by the CDC.
Thank you for that. We had a couple of questions on the topic of vaccines, the work being done for vaccines. This question notes that Oxford University is working on a vaccine that may be available to a small extent by September. I don't know what they're citing for that, but and it says, are other universities working on vaccines, or will this be a race between pharmaceutical companies?
Right, I read that report that there's a lot of hope with the Oxford vaccine. They tested on some rhesus macaques. They gave some of those monkeys enough SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, that you would ordinarily expect all of them to get sick. And it looks like, at least in the small number of macaques they tested, they got a really excellent protection. So if you had a little bit of that vaccine and you have your monkey colony, it's a good thing to have. So that's very promising. There are other steps they'll have to be taking in the vaccine development process, but that's really encouraging news. And there are any number of other people who are taking various other approaches to making vaccines. Some of them are very innovative. One is, which was the first one to get into human testing, was Moderna's vaccine. And what they do there is, instead of injecting you with a virus that's weakened or a little bit of a killed virus, what they do is they inject you with some RNA, some of the genetic material that has the code to manufacture bits of the virus. And the idea is your own cells would pick that up, and your own cells would go about using that RNA to make bits of protein, which your immune system would then recognize, form antibodies, and protect you. So there's a lot going on.
Okay. There was another question, just let me see if I can find it again. I'm sorry here. What will it take to stop the pandemic? Is it very good medication? Will it be a vaccine? What's, from your vantage point, how do we get to a place where we're done with this?
Okay. The question is what will it take to stop the pandemic? And there are a number of approaches, and people have talked back and forth about how practical they are. You might want to look up the reports from Vietnam. It's a one-party state, and they've taken very strict approaches to test people and isolate them, necessary to take them away from their families, to cut down on the spread. And they've just about wiped out SARS-CoV-2 in Vietnam. I'm not sure if we'd be able to get the kind of cooperation to pull that off. Another approach, less extreme, that's been advocated by a number of pretty smart people, is contact tracing, test and trace. And one of the reasons that they're very interested in doing widespread testing is we could identify people who have it. If they do indeed have an infection, they could be isolated so they wouldn't continue to spread it. And we talk with them and find out their contacts, test the contacts. And as we find people who have the virus, isolate them, find out the contacts, isolate them. And this is an approach that was used to some extent in Singapore. They had some success for a while, and then they got a lot of issues with segments of the population that they weren't reaching, with foreign workers who are living in close quarters in dormitories, for example. But some people have called for employing, thousands of people who may have lost their jobs to be contact tracers, and the state of Massachusetts is very busy on this. As we heard earlier, a vaccine could be a real game changer. Now, some vaccines are very effective, some aren't. You always worry about side effects. So this is something where there's a lot of hope. We don't know. There are also some drugs that are being studied, and conceivably, the drugs could make the course of the illness less severe, which would be good news. The drugs also have the possibility of being used to prevent disease in somebody who's been exposed to it. So there are a number of ways in which drugs could be used. Then there's some other possibilities. the experience that we have with seasonal influenza, which is different from COVID-19, but it's similar in that it's a respiratory virus transmitted by droplets. The experience we have with seasonal influenza is that it tends to last in a community about 6 weeks and then just sort of fades out. Not completely, but pretty much. And it may well be that given ordinary social patterns of how many people folks tend to come in contact with after a period of 6 weeks or so, maybe it will burn itself out. Some people have talked about letting it rip through the population to the point where we have herd immunity. And there's a reason why we didn't just let that happen. And the reason I've hinted earlier, I said we have a shortage of surgical masks. We were really not prepared in the hospitals to deal with this. Back a dozen years ago when I had that tabletop exercise, there were people from Cox Cable, and they realized folks would be staying home more, watching more cable TV. So they said, we're going to make things with our cable system so we can deliver more cable TV in case lots of people are at home. And there were messages to people from OPPD that we will staff our electric utility. So even if a third of our workers were sick at the same time, we'd have enough staff to keep powering the Omaha area. Where we fell down was in hospitals. Hospitals failed to plan to have surge capacity for extra beds. That's why they initially thought they'd have to have a hospital ship in New York City. Hospitals failed to have enough cross-training so we could easily have staff to handle things. That's why healthcare workers were flying into New York City to help. And hospitals failed to have adequate stockpiles of the kind of surgical masks, the N95 masks, the other equipment needed to protect healthcare workers. And that's why they've resorted to things like essentially locally developed ways of trying to decontaminate masks so they can be reused. So we really fell down in healthcare. And we were afraid that the hospitals would get overwhelmed. So if you came in with appendicitis, or if a woman came in labor and needed a C-section to deliver the baby, we would just not have anybody to help. And I think a lot of the reason that social distancing was advocated, a lot of the reason that they wanted to have restaurants and bars shut down, schools shut down, was to slow the spread so we wouldn't have this peak of everybody getting sick with COVID-19 at the same time and completely overwhelming the hospitals. So some people said, let's let it rip until we get herd immunity. The concern is that hospitals would be overwhelmed.
Marv, I've got a question for you.
Yes.
Would you fly in an airplane other than a private plane these days? I mean, the air circulation is very limited. It's likely, when people are found to have TB, they do contact tracing and find out many other people sitting around them got TB. When do you think it's going to be safe to go into a commercial airplane?
I think it's pretty safe now, partly because there's so few people flying that the airlines are in a position they can space people out. They have done a number of studies of spread of infections in airplanes, and it turns out you have to be sitting within a row or two of somebody with the infection to pick it up. And it's because of the way air circulation works on ordinary passenger jet aircraft. It turns out that about half the air is recirculated through HEPA filters. So you get this very clean air you don't have to worry about because of the recirculation. The air that's brought in is sucked in through the jet engines at enormous temperatures that are going to kill everything. Then it has to be cooled. And I don't know if you've noticed those little knobs up on top. You can adjust them and have the air start to blow on you a little bit harder. Well, the general circulation of air in an aircraft is just like that. It's within a row from top to bottom. It doesn't tend to go back and forth from the front of the airplane to the back of the airplane. Because you have this highly controlled airflow in an airplane, whenever somebody does report an outbreak of a disease that spreads through the air, it's folks within a row or two. And right now, there's so few people flying, I'm not sure you're going to have anybody within a row or two. Now, you may be getting to the question of how about eventually. Again, I think when you consider how the air is cleaned on an aircraft, I'd have to think it through, but I'm not sure there's going to be that much risk, especially if people are wearing masks, especially if they cover their cough, if you wash your hands, and if somebody who's sick stays home instead of flying.
Mark, great answer to that. Somebody asked about how about homemade quinine, and how about the company that Test Nebraska has been using hasn't done a lot of these kind of studies. I think it's still worth doing, and if the governor is behind it, but how much experience do they have? I'm sure they'll do their best. Is that a problem?
Right. The first question was about how about homemade quinine. And one thing you can say is that, unfortunately, we haven't found any particular drug or treatment that is effective in fighting COVID-19. All we can do is provide so-called supportive care. If somebody needs oxygen, we can give them oxygen, and they, in some cases, may need a ventilator, although if they get sick enough to need a ventilator, oftentimes they don't do too well. And I would advise you, everybody should be thinking, if you were very, very ill, what kind of life-sustaining treatment you'd want to have. Would you want to be put on a ventilator? Would you want to be put on a ventilator the way it is right now, where because of concern about COVID-19, we aren't allowing visitors in the hospital and you have the potential of dying alone? Do you have a lot of other conditions where you just don't have much chance of survival anyway, more than a few months? You might want to, it's very important to think about that. It's very important to have a durable power of attorney for health care and to have a living will. On a brighter note, I can say that people are looking for treatments that might work, and there are a number of studies underway. And the other question you asked was about Test Nebraska. You always get concerned when you have an organization that doesn't have a lot of experience and they get going doing much of anything. I just am not familiar with the folks who are going to be doing the work and rolling up their sleeves for Test Nebraska. I just don't know, but we certainly hope that they were careful in picking out people who can do the job.
Yeah, thank you for that. Let's talk a little bit about seasonality. Do you see the seasons changing? How will fall and winter or summer, before that, I guess, how will that affect the droplets? And does the cold or freezing temperatures cut down on the droplets, or do the droplets thrive in various climates and temperatures? And I'm going to tag on the other question I got is, how long do the droplets stay contagious on hard surfaces? Do they die or dissolve over time? If you could speak to some of the durability of this thing, that'd be great.
So we're getting to how weather conditions are going to affect the transmission of the disease, survival of the virus and droplets, and also how long the virus is going to survive on various surfaces. And it turns out that if you look at laboratory conditions, there was a report where survival of the virus tend to be the worst at about 40 to 60% relative humidity, which is a pretty comfortable relative humidity. It's not too dry, it's not too wet. It's what we aim for in hospitals. And I think you can see how going from the winter months, where a lot of times, unless you have a humidifier that's doing a great job, as we use heat in the Midwest in the winter months, the air gets a little bit dry, and maybe that helps the virus survive. There's a general pattern that we see a lot of respiratory virus infections like influenza, and we see the other members of the coronavirus family that don't cause COVID-19, but there's some cousins in the family that cause common colds. We tend to see those in the colder months. Now, the problem is nobody quite understands everything about seasonality. consider the situation of Singapore, which is just about on the equator. They do have influenza there. And what kind of a pattern are you going to see there? I'm not really sure. I think they see a couple spikes a year. And then you have to take into account that in Singapore, it's so hot and humid that people spend a lot of time in air conditioning. So there's no clear answer to what's going to happen to COVID-19 when you get into different seasons. Some people think that it's going to have the same pattern as pandemic influenza because in both cases, the first wave was late winter to spring, and then they'll say it'll be like that, and there'll be a second wave in the fall, and then maybe a third wave several months later. But it's something of a speculation more than anything else. Now, this in a way relates to the question of how long the virus will survive on an object. And a lot of that has to do with what conditions do you have in your laboratory. Earlier, I mentioned the issue of having the relative humidity at a level that would be more amenable to survival of the virus, and it doesn't survive so well at 40 to 60%. Well, there's studies that can show it depends on the type of surface. On a copper surface, there was one study that showed it didn't survive 4 hours, but on plastic, it survived 72 hours. The practical question, though, is does this really mean anything that it survives for days on plastic? Or is this like that study they did in Portland where they found that the bacteria that cause gonorrhea can survive hours on toilet seats, but we really don't think that many people get gonorrhea from toilet seats? Well, if you think about what it would take to pick up the virus from a surface, first, you'd have to have somebody who had an infection with SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. They'd have to have that infection, and they would have to sneeze or cough or spit on a surface. And they would have to get enough virus on that surface that would have enough that it potentially could infect you. There's some infections that spread with tiny numbers of virus, maybe 10. Others, by and large, you have to give people a fairly large number of viruses or bacteria before you can successfully transmit an infection. But number one, for starters, you have to get enough virus that could cause an infection on the surface. And then it has to do more than survive. You have to have enough virus surviving on the surface before you touch it. Then when you touch it, your hand has to pick up enough virus with that touch that would be an infectious dose, enough to infect people. And then it has to survive on your hand. And you think about it, the SARS-CoV-2 does its damage in the lungs that are a lot warmer than the surface, it's inside your body, it's a lot warmer than the surface of your hand. And then say you have to touch your hand to your face and you have to transfer enough virus that would be an infectious dose. Then somehow you have to rub it in your eyes or nose or mouth and then get enough to do it. And when you get to all those ifs, you can see that by and large, we don't place a lot of emphasis on surfaces as sources of COVID-19. We place a lot more emphasis on when somebody coughs or sneezes on you, or you're just close to them and they're talking enthusiastically or singing or what have you, and a little bit of spit gets directly from them onto you. Then you have a much better chance of picking up the virus. And that goes along with what we see in patterns of transmission. That, as I said earlier, typically if somebody's not doing anything special, they've got COVID-19, they'll infect 2 or 3 other people. So it's the big focus is on the direct droplet transmission as opposed to the objects.
All right, there's a couple of other questions I would like to get to, and this is near the end. So it's been very good, the question and answers so far. I would ask the participants if they have comments what they liked and didn't like. You can also share those in the chat room. We'd like to know some feedback from you, and we'll be contacting you later. But we clean surfaces with a wipe that's supposed to be a sanitary wipe on our kitchen areas and all the surfaces and things that we touch frequently, the doorknobs. And if we get a package from Amazon, we leave it alone for about 24 hours. If we get things from the grocery store that don't need to be put away, we wait a day or so, and we don't read today's newspaper. Is this effective? What do you do about cleaning your surfaces every day?
I don't do any of those things. I mean, I don't, turn my, kitchen into a den of filth, but I don't do a lot of special cleaning because of fears of COVID-19. And partly it's just because of the issue with all the steps that have to happen in order to get an infection from an object. So certainly it's nice to be in a clean area, and there are other types of infections where keeping the environment very clean is really, really important. And so I won't object to it. But one thing I would tell you is if you're looking for ways to disinfect surfaces, just about anything works. This is not a tough virus to kill. There's some viruses or bacteria where it's really pretty tough, and in the hospital we have to use something really strong like bleach. This is not a tough one. The other thing I would think about is that if you consider what's happening when you get a package from Amazon, now maybe the delivery is super fast, but if you think about just the time that would have to pass from when it leaves a warehouse to arrives at your place, you have again the issue of not only do you have to assume that somehow the package got contaminated with a sufficiently high dose that it could cause infection, but it had to survive all that under varying conditions which may not be terribly conducive to survival of the virus. And if you say, oh, well, the delivery person contaminated it, again, you have to say, well, did the delivery person sneeze on it and get enough virus on it? Well, that's one reason why we want people to wear cloth masks. It's going to make it harder to sneeze on things and contaminate objects. Or did the person sneeze on their hand and then contaminate it? But again, if you think about the steps involved, the sneeze has to have enough virus that it could be an infectious dose. The virus has to survive on the hands. When the hands touch the package, you have to transfer enough virus to be an infectious dose. The virus has to survive in a sufficiently large dose on that package, and then you have to touch it and pick it up. So you get to some of the same problems where I would place a huge amount of emphasis on this direct spread. And that's why I keep saying again and again, cover your cough. And then you want to, if you're sick, certainly stay home and wash your hands. We're talking about all these things you might get from an object, but if you then wash your hands, that's going to get rid of the virus and protect you.
Okay, we have a couple other ones. I don't know, Tim, you probably have some too. We've had questions about, it's too bad, but it does affect the homeless and the vulnerable especially. That's why it's good that we have some ways of contacting people that we're worried about. Also, there's a question about when we return to a more normal state, and more people are going to restaurants even though they're separated. How soon will it take for us to know whether that's a bad idea or not? I know testing would be needed. Also, somebody mentioned that they would like to share this recording with their family. So Marv, that's a big thank you to you.
Go
we
ahead,
are
yes.
recording this. I am recording this, and Timothy is as well. So it should be available. So what do you think about when are we going to know when it's safe to come back? Oh,
Okay, first, it's a good point that there's some populations where we're very, very concerned. We're concerned about homeless populations. There have been outbreaks in prisons. You may have heard about the problem with the nursing home in Kirkland, Washington, near Seattle. It's not the only one where there's been an issue. So there are a number of settings, and a lot of it can be put together if you just think about this as a droplet spread condition where there's the sneezing, the people who talk a little bit too enthusiastically, and you feel a little bit of spit, and you say it, don't spray it. Unfortunately, there are those situations. It's hard to know when things would get completely back to normal. And there's some different concepts of this. The most optimistic is that it would somehow act like seasonal influenza, and for some reason, after about 6 weeks in a community, just fade out. Now, even then, there may be some cases, just as we have straggler cases of influenza. But the reason that's an optimistic view is that that might happen fairly soon. Another view is that we're really not going to be back to normal till we have a vaccine where we can protect so many people that the virus is going to have a tough time finding somebody that isn't immune and just won't be able to keep going. And there, people were talking about 12 to 18 months if things went well. There are people who, as we heard earlier, are extremely optimistic about the Oxford vaccine, maybe sooner. And then there are people who say that if you look at the history of vaccines that have been developed recently, you're talking about a lot more than a year and a half before it becomes widely available. So that's another view. Then there are the people who say we'll get going on tracing and testing. And in theory, if they really ramped up tracing, testing, isolation, in a matter of weeks, you could isolate people. That's essentially the experience in Vietnam. But I'd have to point out that Vietnam is one end of the spectrum in terms of being a one-party state with a lot of regimentation. So I have to say that at this point, I may be a board-certified infectious disease specialist with a master's degree in clinical epidemiology, but I can only offer some possibilities and not make that much of a prediction, and tell you that in the meantime, again, cover your cough, wash your hands, stay home if you're sick.
You've made your points very, very well, and I want to thank you once again. We may have time for a couple more questions, but this is about it. I wanted to let you know that we plan to make available the contacts for the CDC website and NIH website. And also, these are general comments, and you can't use them in every instance. And I just want to make sure that we have an indemnification statement here, that you have to stay tuned to what the latest information is, because things change pretty rapidly. And
that's a good point, John, because some of the people that I've been working with, at the hospital have been getting very frustrated because they'll say, okay, what's our plan for doing tests? And a couple of days later, I tell them something different, or they'll say, what are we going to do about the garb we're going to wear when somebody's in isolation? And, as the situation changes, I'll say one thing on Monday and another thing on Wednesday. So, in one sense, it's a great idea to record this if somebody wants to look at this and share it, but there's a good chance that by the time you view this, a fair amount of what I've said will be wrong. And again, some people are in some very special situations with very special medical situations or social situations, and some things may not apply. I guess you may know perhaps you've seen the internet meme. If you Google Vincent van Gogh COVID-19 mask, and think about masks that attach to ears, there's somebody who's in a special situation.
All right, Timothy, do you have any last minute comments?
I just wanted to touch on one thing. You mentioned looking for consistencies in the medical literature earlier on in your presentation. Are there any inconsistencies that you see prominently talked about in the media or the news that maybe is not as helpful? Are you coming across some of those things?
Right. There are a number of things where there's some differences of opinion. There's a guy who's an internal medicine faculty member at Oregon Health Sciences University, Vinay Prasad, V-I-N-A-Y, Prasad, P-R-A-S-A-D, who has made something of a career with the theme of medical reversal. He likes to study concepts in medicine that are strongly held at one point in time, and then 10, 20 years later, it turns out they're wrong. And he's actually been getting involved in some controversies with some contrary views about some of the best ways to deal with COVID-19, some of the government restrictions, and so on. So there's a bit of a controversy there. Earlier I mentioned the controversy of the people who do the nebulization and are able to have SARS-CoV and these fine particles that simulate airborne transmission. But if you look at how things work out in the real world, it doesn't work that way. But if you talk to those people, they've expressed some of their views so strongly that Jeff Gold, who's chancellor at UNMC, had to make a little video and walk back some of their statements. And then there are the people who have enthusiasm for various sorts of treatments. The sad truth is, at this point, there are people who have a lot of hope about various treatments, but we really can't say, take drug X or treatment Y, and this is going to help you. And the concern is that there have actually been some misinterpretations that I think somebody took some product that was intended for animals and overdosed on it and got very ill, or people have taken some drugs that have generated a lot of enthusiasm in some circles, and they have wound up with some very serious heart problems. So I think there are a number of areas where there are controversies. That's why I'm so glad that John pointed out how important it is for you to go to cdc.gov or nih.gov.
Very good. I want to thank you very much, Marv. You were wonderful, and comments are coming in. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule. You do these kind of talks. It's clear, you know what you're talking about, and you put it in a way that we can all understand it. But we must remember that we have to stay tuned and keep updated, because this is a fast moving field and there will be false news, and you want to make sure that you're getting the right news. And be very careful and ask your own physician if you have a problem, and ask somebody who knows more than you do. That's a good thing to do in general. Timothy, any final comments?
Oh, I think this was fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Bittner, for spending your time with us and our community here at Riverfront. I know people are very grateful for that. We had a good showing on our participant list. Thank you, John, for organizing this. It's fantastic to have high caliber people at our community that can help facilitate this kind of stuff. It's really a neat thing to see. So thank you both for your time.
Thanks for everybody for making this a success, and take care of yourselves. Wash your hands, keep your distance, but stay connected to people, and stay tuned. All right, I'm going to end the meeting, folks. Thank you so much.
Thank you, John.
Bye now.